everyone to the Spring Speaker Series kickoff event. Peter Gould speaking of many things, including horse-drawn yogurt. I just have a few practical announcements before we start. Peter will engage us both in speaking and conversation, I think, for about 45 minutes. There'll be a short break after that, and then some question and answer. Next in the series, in 2 weeks on the 26th, we're hosting Sanjukta Ghosh, who's going to be talking. Her talk is called Pop Goes History, and it's taking a look at Coca-Cola and its representation of American influence, which can cause us to cringe or celebrate, depending. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Peter Gould, author, clown, director, writer most recently of Horse-Drawn Yogurt, copies of which we have available for purchase. Peter's fertile imagination and immense creativity is one of the myriad reasons that Vermont became the state that we know today. So without further ado, Peter Gould.
So, thank you very much, everybody. I'm happy to be here. And I have all sorts of things to speak about, and now it's my job to sort of think about what's the most important thing and to follow through with the through line. How many people here in this room have come to Vermont because it's sort of like a lifeboat for them? Like maybe they were picturing that they might not succeed in other parts of the world, and they heard about this place and they come here. You don't have to put up your hands, but if you do put up your hands, you'll see that you're not alone. That's sort of how it was for me. That's sort of how it still is for me. I don't know whether you know it, but 1968 was the beginning of the movement that was called Back to the Land, and it's really interesting to be talking about that right now, because if you can do your math, it's exactly 50 years since 1968 the Back to the Land movement took place. So I'm hoping to talk to a lot of people throughout this year about the events back in 1968 that drove me here, because it certainly brought me here because it was a lifeboat for me too. 1968 was a year that you, if you'd been alive there to experience it, was so upsetting, and it kept you completely off balance. You'd open up the newspaper, or you'd look at the TV screen and wonder what it was going to be today that was going to knock you further right off balance, in a way that you wondered, whether the democratic way of life that we had throughout the United States was going to survive. Sort of how it is right now. Right now, this day, because you open up the paper or you look at the news on the internet, almost afraid, heart beating a little bit fast to see what might have happened yesterday to throw us further off balance. Yes? No?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. That's the way I feel. I'm glad some of you feel that way too here. But I was a part of a movement that was so upset by the Vietnam War, because the Vietnam War was on TV. It was not like the wars that we're fighting now, which are so remote. Now we can fight a war, we can have soldiers over there, and we don't have to deal with the day-to-day results, the consequences. They had, when the Vietnam War was on, there were reporters, there was television crews, right in battle, and they would film the battle scenes of the day. They would film United States soldiers going into villages and burning down huts. You'd see people dying and hear the people screaming. There were body counts every day, just like a sports thing, when you look at how many of the enemy had been killed and how many United States soldiers had been killed. And for many of us who were just growing up into our late teens or early 20s at that time, it was just horrible. And there was a movement to get away from that, and it all began to crystallize in 1968. And it started when it started in this month of February, just about the time of the New Year, the Chinese New Year, which is called Tet, I guess in Vietnamese, when the offensive that the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese launched against the United States soldiers, which didn't necessarily come out a success. It was a bad enough almost defeat for the United States that it seemed like everybody could finally admit that the war was going badly, even though some of us have been hollering for years that the war was never going to be won. And so that was the first thing, people beginning to admit at the highest levels that maybe the war had been a mistake, and then President LBJ deciding to resign because of that, and then the assassination of Martin Luther King and the burning of 100 cities throughout the United States. You heard about that, and then well, we thought, okay, is that the last thing for the year? But then Bobby Kennedy, and I will never forget. I'll never forget watching Bobby Kennedy dying on the floor of the kitchen of the convention hall in LA, moments after he'd been declared the winner of the California primary. And it was just horrible, event after event that kept you off balance. And it ended, the final event, not the final event of that year, but the final event that pushed people out to the countryside to leave the cities was the convention in Chicago, August of 1968, when we could all watch on television the cops rioting and busting heads of people who looked exactly like me on the streets, and so thousands of people, thousands of young people my age, decided at that point that it was just the life in the cities, the life on the streets was just too hard to survive, and many people joined a movement back to the land. We didn't know that it was a movement. It only a couple of years later began to be defined as a movement. But I asked you the question as to whether some of you felt like Vermont was a lifeboat for you, because it certainly felt like a lifeboat for me. But escaping the Vietnam War and what was going on in the cities in response to the Vietnam War was not the reason. When I really come to look at it and think about it, that was really not the reason that I moved to the farm in Vermont. I'm just going to read you a passage from my newest book, Horse-Drawn Yogurt. I've written a lot of books. They're all up here. You can see them later if you want. But this is my first nonfiction. And I was having a hard time with this particular story. I was writing it. I've been working on this for a few years. And I was writing this story and working on it, and it just didn't seem to gel for me. And I suddenly decided, instead of writing it as I would write it as you. And when I made the choice to write it in the second person, it all began to come out the way I wanted it to sound. Okay. And this is in the middle of a story written in the second person, and it's about how I journeyed to a little village in Oaxaca, in Mexico, to get seeds to bring back to the farm. And this is in my 5th or 6th year at the farm. And I was so overwhelmed by the life in the village and the way that these people went about their day that I just wanted, I wanted to bring back some of that faith, some of that deep love of the earth to the farm, because up until then I'd only been playing at it. So here's the passage. It's about when I was beginning to think about leaving the farm after 7 or 8 years. You have no interest in earning money. You never will. You've lost that. And you know you would never be content with the gift of pure contemplative self-knowledge. It's not the knowing that you want, it's the doing. And now you perceive that all your years at the farm, there was a retreat from all that. Yes, there's living in peace and farming and fatherhood and all the ways that the community forged new knowledge of garden and kitchen activities. But it's not enough. You want to be an important part of the world beyond the fields and woods at the farm. Admit it, acknowledge it, but bury the truth in a story deep in your book. It's where it's buried. You moved to the farm out of fear. Not fear for your nation at war, but fear for yourself because you stuttered. You came to bracket what had been and try to start over. You came to find your voice. And of course you did. Faced with the choice, who would pick? Going to terrifying job interviews, high-stakes encounters with higher status men, working in an office, running away and hiding from the telephone when it rang, getting stoned at night in a too hot or too cold third-floor apartment. If instead you could be talking without hesitation to the animals, swimming naked, smoking the mellow, relaxed, homegrown, mastering seasonal outdoor chores, chanting druid talk in the forest, hugging trees, literally hugging trees, and making tools, bread, building stone walls, love, and children. With the war and the movement, you had a social impetus and a cultural a cover to wear, and how you spent the last the last 7 years. But really, your individual reason for being here was more important. How many people in this room have an individual reason for being here? A very strong individual. I was moved to come to Vermont. Yes, there was a war, and yes, there was a movement. But it seemed to me a place where I could come and I could deal with my neurodiversity. Have you ever heard that expression? I was differently abled. Some of you are differently abled too. I was wired to be a student that never spoke in class. I couldn't speak in class because I stuttered so badly, and it made me feel so awful about being in school that gave me a harder time in school. How many people here have ever had a hard time in school? Okay, so you understand. Now it was, and people thought maybe I was stupid because I never spoke out in class, but I wasn't. I knew so much in my heart what I was like, what I was inside, and I knew that there must be a way to me to actually live the truth, which I knew about myself, right? But I hadn't been able to do it for all those years. And it was sort of like because there was a movement back to the land, I could get into that movement, and it was like launching yourself on a boat down a stream, and you sort of go with the current. So I ended up here, and I ended up, I had always wanted to write. 2 weeks after I arrived in Vermont and moved to the farm, my father died. And I went home for a little while to be at the funeral and to help out my mom. But I had this tremendous impulsion to come back to Vermont and continue what I'd started. And one of the things I'd started with was to build myself a little house, not really an individual house, but a room above a tractor shed. And I learned all the different skills that I needed to do: hammer, saw, insulation, caulking windows. But I really also wanted to write a book. And after I'd been at the farm for a few months, I realized that in the dead of winter, and we had winters there then, the winter of 1969, 70, there was snow up to the eaves, and there were about 3 weeks when it was 15 below zero, almost unbroken, and there was nothing to do at the farm except try to survive. Our firewood was green, hemlock. It made an awful sound in the stove. It didn't put out a whole lot of heat, so naturally I didn't spend much time up in my room because I didn't want to waste the small amount of firewood we had. And we all sort of congregated in the old farmhouse. You know what old farmhouses were like. There was not a lot of insulation in the walls. The windows were cracked. But there was one room where I felt it could be silent enough for me to write. Silent is actually cool because the hero of my book, Burnt Toast, is called Silent. That's his name. Can you picture why I called the hero of my first novel Silent? Good. But it wasn't silent enough for me to write. On the first day of the new year, 1970, I took my typewriter out and I set it up in the green room, and I sat down to write and opened up my shoebox full of notes I had taken from my first novel, and I wanted to write my new book, and I knew it was going to be called Burnt Toast, and it was my first novel, and I started to write, and I couldn't write because the clock on the bookshelf, which was a brass sculpture of a horse, every time the minute hand went up to the 12, the clock went like that. So I pulled out the plug at 6 minutes after 4, and that clock has never been plugged in since. So I always remember exact time, exact date when I started to write my novel, Burnt Toast. Here's the photo of me, the book cover. How did I know this? I mean, I had an idea for a book. How many people have ever had an idea and said, where did that idea come from? You ever had that happen to you? I have a whole theory about where ideas are from. Okay? Do you want to hear about it?
Sure.
I feel like ideas have wings, and they're flying around, and they're really tired because some of them have been flying around in the atmosphere or in rooms around you or out there outside of the buildings. Some of them have been flying around for decades, centuries, and they're just looking for one fertile brain to land in. You know, but so many of the brains are distracted by music and ear pods and advertisement and violence and all this content that the media all around us stuff in our brains all the time, that it's getting harder and harder for these great ideas that are flying around out there, and they're getting tireder and tireder to find a fertile brain to land in because the brains are so stuffed full. That's why I teach meditation. Telling people, okay, for 15 minutes, for 20 minutes, could we sit still and empty our minds and not let anybody else's content get in there? I tell people, if you don't take responsibility for your own mind, somebody else is going to take responsibility for it. So you better, it's like a speed date with yourself. I mean, when you meditate, it's like a speed date with yourself. And you better get yourself looking good and feeling good and giving a good impression, because you might not know it, but you're going to be spending all the rest of your life with that person. Right? So I tell people to meditate because you're going to get clarity. You're going to get clarity about what path you should be on. Clarity about gifts when they're dumped into your lap. Clarity about people. Is this a good person to meet or maybe not so good person to meet? And you get clarity enough to recognize a good idea when one lands in your brain. What do you usually do when you have an idea? Where did that come from? Land in your brain. What do you do about it?
I write it down immediately.
Yes, you write it down immediately. And the reason that you write it down immediately, if I may presume, is that it's a responsibility. Because that idea has chosen your brain, and it possibly hasn't chosen somebody else's brain. And it lands in your brain, and wow, you're there, and you write it down. At the farm, some people sometimes had ideas, and in the morning they were gone. I won't explain why. But we had a sign up there that said, not responsible for lost ideas. So that's good if you write them down. I had an idea for this novel, Burnt Toast. Do you want to know why it's called Burnt Toast?
Sure. Yeah.
Because in certain states of consciousness that I had when I was 22, 23 years old, when I would sit there, I would suddenly have a hallucination of a piece of something right in front of my eyes, and it looked like burnt toast. It wasn't burnt toast. It just had the shape and the sound and the quality and the color of burnt toast. And I wouldn't have done anything much with it except for the fact that every time I saw it, it gave me pleasure. And also every time that I saw it, it gave me the thought that this is a mystery. And if you can understand this, you can understand anything. So that was enough reason for me to write it down and to note every time that it happened. And I couldn't make it happen. It only happened by surprise, like the best ideas do. And I followed it through by writing a novel all about a young man called Silent who saw the illusion of burnt toast. I didn't know it at the time. And actually, you could actually say that the title of my little speech to you tonight is Be Responsible for Your Ideas, because you never know. And it's also, another title could be Ripple. You know the idea that if you drop a stone in the water and the ripples go out and you have no idea where the ripples are going to be and where they're going to take you. I didn't know that the publishing houses in New York City were waiting for the first novel about communes, because it was not just an individual response from somebody because of the way that he was wired to come to Vermont and sort of hide out for 8 or 9 or 10 years. It was a movement, and the movement was beginning to gain steam, and there were communes all over the whole United States, and people were moving, and that they were leaving their schools, leaving their colleges, leaving their graduate schools, coming home from the war, running away from home because of terrible situations at home, and moving to collective households to farm and to get to know the source of their own food in every single state. And there hadn't been a novel, kind of a fantasy novel, written about that yet, so I wrote the first one. Got a $3,000 advance from Alfred A, and that's about like a $20,000 advance today. And for a while, our farm was eating something besides the 50 bags of frozen wax beans in the freezer. You know, and we had that kind of binge mentality. Sometimes there was a lot of money. Sometimes there was a lot of food. Sometimes there was hardly anything to eat. Sometimes you felt really good about life, and sometimes life seemed hard. An editor, a book agent from New York City, drove up to the farm and said, "Love that book. We're going to buy your next book. Just sign on this line." And I went, "I don't have any other book to write. I'm a farmer now. Going to learn how to milk a cow, how to make cheese, all that." And he said, "Well, maybe you get everybody on the farm to get together to write a book and show us how it's done," right? So we did, and that book was called Home Comfort. And it was New American Library, Saturday Review Press, Book of the Month Club. I don't even know if Book of the Month Club still exists. But mail arrived at households all over the United States with an image of this book saying, "Hey, for just $19.95, you can get this book and you can join our club." We were beginning to write down the ideas that occurred to us, not only as individuals, but ideas of the whole group. You know, how we could live together. How many people here have ever lived in a group? Like in a really tight group where everything was shared. Shared your car, shared your money, shared your food, shared your bed, all that stuff. It's really hard. I mean, I had been raised in a very traditional household, and it was difficult for me to learn how to have that level of sharing at almost every level of my life. But we did get to do it, and we wrote a book about it. I'm going to read something from it. We had ideals. This is from Home Comfort. It's a story that I wrote called How I Came to the Farm, towards the end of it. "We will help each other. It's not hard. We will not murder, harm, spite, or judge each other. We will not take profit from, scorn, or exploit another person's work. We will repeal the never wished for orders to consume, spend, waste, and exhaust. We will dismantle the war machines and choking industries that feed them. We will ignore the ill advice that separates us into silent children at our desks, into locked apartments, into nations. We want to be joined and responsible. We want to spend the rest of our days taking care of the planet as we are learning to take care of the farm. We will be gentle with it. It will be our center. We will be responsible and grateful. We will know and love our own nature far beyond words or thoughts. Know what that we are a part of, just a part. We will eat good food and not spread blindly, unfairly over the earth. We will be together with each other and with animals and plants who will love us in the ritual seasonal dances that call up, name, and exercise the violence, darkness, and ignorance in us. We will master them and not need masters. We will have and be light and dark, spiritual, sexual, city, farm, and wilderness. We will have no enemy. We will look into each other's eyes and no longer see the division that's made men blind to the one vast being that mystics and physicists stake their daily lives on. I don't know if I'm awake or dreaming. I don't know if it's night or morning. We seem to be sitting in a quiet room deep in the earth. Our gazes meet as if we know each other very well, though we may very well have been strangers a moment ago. We all have stories to tell, and we'll tell them. Though we may feel that we have been here all our lives, though we may never leave, we're still travelers in paths whose direction and rhythm you have to look deep into nature to see, like the swallow flying back to the barn, like Sirius the dog star over the peach orchard hill. We are all travelers. What do you seek here, since this world is not your resting place? I don't know what came over me when I wrote that, but I was trying to say, that we were trying to not be so individualistic as we had been raised, and it's just amazing to me that this book, it was written in 1972, prefigures the movement that we have today, in which it's becoming absolutely crucial that people who believe in climate change get together and do what they can to save the planet that we're all on. Any feedback so far? You okay? Okay. So anyway, but this is the fact that this idea landed in my brain. The reason that I brought up this book is to give you that passage. But, 11 or 12 of us got into a van, and we drove down to New York City for a publishing party for this book. We put our best clothes on, which were not very best at all, and we thought we smelled okay. And we drove, the closer we got to New York City, the more uncomfortable we felt about how we looked, or how we appeared. And we got to the skyscraper where the publishing house for New American Library was, and the elevator man looked us over and said, "We're just going to a publishing party. Our book up to the 40th floor, please." He was like, "Sure." This was a Friday afternoon. And we all squeezed into the elevator. We went up there, and we got out, and we were in right there in the offices of New American Library. And they had spread out this feast for us. And remember I said feast or famine, binge mentality? I mean, we were people who did not see tables groaning with shrimp and dip. Strawberry fondue and all this stuff. And cheeses, I milked a cow. I made cheese. I went around to the communes that were within a 50-mile radius, and I taught all the communes that had bought a cow recently how to make cheese, the basic cheese. And my cheeses were terrible. I'm proud of the fact that Vermont has become, we're living in the golden age of cheese right now, and it all started back at our farm when 5 or 6 of us who knew how to milk Bessie, and we got like 11 or 12 gallons of milk a day, and we had to preserve it in some way. I said, "It's okay, I'll figure this out," and I learned how to make a cheddar cheese, and maybe 1 out of 10 was edible, But there were these beautiful cheeses made by people who were generations of cheese-making families, and it was all there, and the people were so excited to see us, and they shook our hands, and they said our book was going to do very well. But remember I said it was a Friday afternoon? Yeah. Well, at 5 o'clock, we suddenly looked around, and everybody who worked at the publishing company was gone. And it was only us from the farm. And yet the table was still groaning with all these delectable foods. So we fanned out throughout the whole offices, and we found every bag, every plastic bag liner for waste paper baskets, and we shoveled all the food and the cheese and the bread and the wine and the beer and everything like that into the bags, and we just walked out of there and went back in the elevator, the same elevator. Man was there. Goodbye. And we lugged the stuff out to the van and drove all the way back to Vermont. A binge mentality. And that would never, and all these things sort of fed off one another. Somebody had an idea for a book, and so it just became a ripple fanning out. I wanted to tell you about that because, as you say, when you get an idea, you have to write it down, but you also have to appreciate it as being an idea that chose you, and it gives you a tremendous responsibility. And you can't even put into words what the responsibility of that idea is. You can't even know what ripples are going to fan out from the idea that you had, that you took the responsibility to write down, and then when you had some time, you developed it into an idea that could be read by other people. I left the farm, and I had some ideas for a nonfiction book that I eventually would write down, stuff that I had written about farm work. And one of the things I did was I just was getting too worn down by farm work. I was a mason, I built stone chimneys, I lugged a lot of milk buckets, I built fences, and I had a kid who was 5 years old, almost 6 when I left the farm, and I realized that the farm was crushing me down. And I wasn't using some of the gifts that I was born to have. But I was getting a lot more fluent because I hadn't been in the outside world. I could talk to the animals, could talk to the trees. I went to Mexico to study mime because that was one of the things that I'd always found as a good way for me to express myself if I wasn't going to speak. And I studied at a circus school and a mime school in Mexico. Learned a lot about nonverbal communication. While I was there, the United States was making war in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And I came back, and some months later I was listening to the radio, and I heard a report about the assassination of the Archbishop of El Salvador, Monsignor Romero. And I went, oh my God, the guy who's telling the story on the news, he doesn't know anything about what he's saying. He's just repeating what somebody has sent over as a dispatch. And he doesn't know why the war is going on in El Salvador, why the United States intervention is so wrong. Somebody has got to tell the story. And it should be somebody who's fluent in Spanish. It should be somebody who studied Latin American studies. It should be somebody who can write. It should be somebody who's traveled to Latin America. It should be somebody who's actually worked the land and knows how to plow with hand tools. It should be. It should be somebody who does theater and who knows how to go out on stage and perform. And so I wrote this play, which was not a play at first, a peasant of El Salvador. And this was sort of a crowning achievement of my life up to that point. It meant more to me than the novel and the collection of stories, because it said somebody could tell the story who really understands it, and about why an old man who was farming his land would end up at a funeral for the Archbishop of El Salvador and get killed, and what were the events in his life that brought him there in the first place. It was an idea. And it was an idea that had wings, and it landed in my brain, and I wrote it down, and I took responsibility for it. I didn't know that Peter Abel, the local orthodontist, would hear about the play, and that it would spark his interest because he was already thinking a lot about El Salvador, and that he decided to take a couple friends down to El Salvador and see for himself. And then he came back and got the Rotary Club to sponsor a performance of this which is now a 2-person play. And the Rotary Club said, this is really cool, and they formed a delegation to go down to El Salvador and develop a sister town project with a town in El Salvador. So the 5 or 6 representatives from Vermont went to this town in El Salvador and said, what do you need? And they said, we need water. We need water that we can drink. They went, okay, we're on it. And they hired an engineer back here to develop a solar still to purify water. And they took it down there, and it worked. And a few other towns heard about it, and a few other Rotary Clubs heard about it. And the Rotary Club decided to go to districts and to give a lecture demonstration about the solar still. And other Rotary Clubs around New England decided to make it their project too. And then Rotary International heard about it and declared the following year Pure Water for the World. And they re-upped every year until a nonprofit corporation called Pure Water for the World, which is now an international organization developed solely to give water that people can drink at any place in the world where they haven't had potable water. And it all started because I wrote this freaking play. Because it was it's not a brag. It's what it is. It's an impulse to you. If you have an idea, you have no idea why that idea chose you, and what effect you could possibly have, the ripple effect, beyond this ripple and that ripple and that ripple. You have no idea. That's why if an idea chooses you, you have to take the responsibility and work with it, because it's yours, but it's not really yours. It's been given to you because of some magical thing. and you have no idea where it's going to go. So you have to develop it in some way and let it out there, because then it's not yours anymore, but there's a really good chance that somebody else is going to take it and run with it. Okay, you get that? So that's really what the talk is about. Ideas are magical. They come from magical places. They choose you. You have to work with them, because you never know what the ripple effect of that idea is going to be. That's all I have to say about that. Do you want to hear? So speaking of ideas, my wife Molly, who's here, has had this idea for years that I should take some of these stories I told her about the farm and write them up as a nonfiction book, which is difficult for me because I like to write fiction. And I didn't realize when I sat down to do it how much fun it would be to collate some of the stories and put them together. And they've already had some effect. I know that some people have read the book, and it's given them some idea. And I just got an email yesterday from a young man upstate who has, because he's reading this book, got an idea that it would be nice to start an organization in and around his town to get people who had interesting life stories to tell their stories and put them together. And he was asking me if I could come up and help to get that going. This is a story about one of the things that we did really, really well at the farm. Long before it was an important thing going on in the state. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the story is called Wait, Don't Throw That Away, and it's about recycling. Now, of course, recycling is something that we all do, right? We're real conscious about it, but not so back then. There was so much we recycled or saved from destruction, sometimes not even for our own use, sometimes just to caretake for a while. Historic preservation. We drove into town. They were wrecking the 19th century library. Why? Who let them do that? Oh, this here is going to be a parking lot for the post office trucks. Makes sense. But the carved and painted Brattleboro Free Library sign, you don't want it? You don't? You're throwing it out? Well, how about if we rescue it and nail it up on our barn? And then when you come to your senses, say in about 10 years, you'll know where it is and you can have it back. You're welcome. If you go into Brattleboro Library, you see it right there. We arrived several years too late to save the famous four-tiered balconied Brattleboro Town Hall, a concert venue visited by the most famous performers of their time. What a jewel in the crown of Vermont performing arts places it would be today if it still stood on Main Street, not brought down in its prime by the wrecking ball to make room for a 5 and dime. Forgive us if we felt that no one wanted to save the stuff but us. It's as if folks around here didn't want to be reminded of or hobbled by the past. But we offered to take it on. We didn't look too deeply at the downsides of the traditions and the technologies we recycled. You could say that was a superficial act, even a false or presumptuous one. But no, there was equivalent generosity on both sides and that shared sense of danger. The danger that so much would be lost. The danger that wherever there's a tradition worth saving, if someone doesn't say, we'll make that memory ours, then it will vanish into a new victorious conformity, so powerful that even the dead will not be safe. That's why I'm writing this book. We took on their past, but we didn't take it personally. It wasn't ours. That past of our neighbor farmers was hard. There was death, there was disappointment, and pure hard work, and life-altering injury, and war, and no electricity or television or plumbing. And what was the point of holding on to stuff that made you feel like part of you? A heavy part was stuck in the 19th century or earlier, gathering dust. Dust. Dust is what brings me to the subject of the Boston and Maine Railway Freight Depot. One morning, in 1975, I was sipping my coffee in the farm kitchen, going over the plans for our sugar house and reading the newspaper too, the Brattleboro Reformer. I saw a photo of the old Boston and Maine freight depot up in Bellows Falls. They were going to tear it down next week. In fact, they were going to burn it down to give Bellows Falls Fire Brigade some practice. If we could get there first, it could be our biggest recycling job ever. I mean, back in the days of the farms, everything that was built out of recycled wood. Nobody ever went to a lumber mill and got a new 2x4. That old freight depot's time had come. True, it was a solid Victorian house where weary trainmen ate and slept, coupled to a 100-foot-long loading dock covered from all weather. But 1976 would be America's bicentennial year, and Amtrak wanted to build a cheap metal and plastic cubicle of a station with a bicentennial exhibit. The idea was you wreck the big, living, dust-covered history. You get rid of it completely. No trainmen need to sleep here anymore. And erect a waypoint, a talking point, a surrogate that a family of tourists can take in at one quick glance. Maybe today they would hesitate. Maybe they'd post a request for proposals, repurpose the whole building for mixed use, low-income housing, some self-storage units, a permanent farmer's market, a value-added product incubator, yoga studios, a woman's shelter. But not back then. We got the Bellows Falls town manager on the phone, and we must have hit his sympathy button. He gave us 5 days for 6 bonded people to get out as much material as we could before the firemen set it ablaze. The first day we spent gathering hammers, sledges, wrecking bars, the farm chainsaw, and buying insurance. We tracked down the front door key. We walked the premises. We pulled off the easiest boards. The second day we spent like kids at a candy shop, excited, constantly distracted, taking up superficial armfuls of salvage, not making a dent. The place was massive and tight. Its joints resisted our wrecking bars. Every surface rained coal dust when struck with a hammer. Coal dust is toxic, black and granular. The 3-story house had been built so roll-top desks would stay open, and steel cots with sleepy railway men would not shake whenever a mile-long train rumbled by, carrying its heavy load to the heartland. The freight dock had held up for a century while young industrial America moved its mill machinery, its granite and marble blocks, its grain, its engines, its printing presses. On the 3rd and 4th day, we hit our stride. Those 2 evenings, we rode home tired, sore, and coal-grimed, our truck heaped high with tongue-and-groove pine boards, shelving, siding, doors, steel lockers, windows. But we had played approach avoidance with the depot floor. We could have spent our final day trying to pull out as much wood as we could from the easier places, but we all shared the same curiosity, to see why the freight floor was so solid, to find out what lay under its planks. We had come to love the majestic building. With every board we removed, we sensed the loss. We felt the impending doom of fire, but strange to say, this made us work even slower on our last day. We in the building were savoring each other. We were like parting lovers, spent of activity and lost in contemplation. Maybe we thought if we slowed down, time would slow down too. Maybe it was wrong to rush around, chopping, splitting, tearing out as much as we could. From wherever we had dispersed to on the job site, the 6 of us were pulled back wordlessly to the huge freight landing. Irrationally, we denied the great haste we all shared by concentrating on one small area. This would yield less recycled wood, but it would give us a shared important memory, a trace of what we might have had we had time. And by focusing on this one place, we would not spend this last day mourning the destruction of the lumber, the history around us. That day it took all our strength and ingenuity to liberate 4 or 5 16-foot 2x12s. Can you picture how big that is? The decking perpendicular to the train tracks and get a good grasp on what held them up from below. 6x8 joists on 2-foot centers parallel to the train tracks. These in turn rested on 10x16s. That's right, turned 90 degrees, ends pointing right at the tracks. By cutting the 6x8s with a chainsaw and reaching down into the hole with ropes, we were able to extract one 12-foot length of 10x16. There must have been 160 of these at least, clear, first growth, iron hard and heavy. If someone had that building today, the salvaged wood sawed up would be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. We never found out how long they were, but they were the kind of ship-mast timber over which a king and his colonies would fight a war. They were as strong as a skyscraper's steel I-beams. And sandwiched between the 2 transverse courses of joists and beams were huge circus posters. Why? Who knew why? What builder's crazy idea? To catch the coal dust? They were colorful and fun, from an age when the big top, like our republic, was the greatest show on earth and traveled by train. We swept the dust away to see a portion of a barebacked rider and a big, sad elephant's eye. We went back to the town manager. We told him about the beams, but he wasn't interested. You could saw them into lumber. They'd be so beautiful, make money for the town. We told him about the circus poster as big as a barn. Priceless if we had time to get it out in one piece and truck it to a museum. Too bad. Burn was scheduled. It was coming, unstoppable, like a forest fire. We had to pack what we could and get out of the way. I saw the photo in the paper a few days later, one of those staged pictures with a firefighter standing in a smiling group, their backs to the blazing building. The bicentennial came and went too, and then the waypoint was taken down and the parking lot abandoned, and there's no sign of either building on the site now. I think about the moment when we saw the circus poster. When you dig in the past, it's the unexpected things that bring you up short. It's a moment I'd like to have back. I'd like to stretch it into a month and take the time to pull up all those 2-inch floorboards and the 6x8 joists. I'd save the circus posters. I'd build an exhibition around them. I'd pull those 10x16s. I'd blow the coal dust off. I'd remill them. And folks would come with their lumber trucks and carry off thousands and thousands of feet of the finest, clearest old-growth pine or chestnut boards you ever saw. They'd want to pick a spot in their building project where folks would see them and ask and find out what they were. But better yet, with a moment taken back proper, I wouldn't tear the freight depot down at all. I'd leave it standing. I wouldn't even repurpose it. I'd have 2 long freight trains a day throttled down and stop by the falls that gives the factories their hydropower and the town its name. I'd have a fresh railway crew in pressed blues and ticking come down from the second-floor kitchen, still smelling of coffee and bacon, replacing the tired crew from Boston or Maine, exchanging a joke or a story. Wagons and trucks would be waiting on the platform. Crowds of working people would load and unload the big, heavy stuff over the sound of the falls and the train's 2 powerful engines, the iron and hard rubber wheels on the depot floor. Over the calling of the workmen and workwomen, you'd hear the sound of heavy manufacturing up the hill from the depot and the river, the throbs, hums, thrums, grinds, roars, wails, and whistles you used to hear all over the country. Not the quiet you hear now, sinking downhill from the town. I want to share one more thing with you. Okay? Do you have time? It might be going a little bit long, but it's a further illustration. It's the video. So now we've established, right, that things happen in the world, right? And they give you ideas. Right? And the ideas land in your brain, and you're responsible for them. And your responsibility is to take that idea and run with it a little bit to see if it might make a ripple. Okay? You get it? So a year ago, I was at home, and President Donald Trump had issued his proclamation that airplanes arriving in the United States with people coming back from the Christmas vacation and people coming back to continue their studies. Second semester was about to start. People coming to rejoin their families. People coming here maybe for the first time because they had been invited to become visiting scholars. People coming for the first time because they were refugees. They would all be stopped at the airport and they'd be put back on the planes and sent back to areas of war, or they'd be sequestered into rooms where they would get interrogated, not even able to make a phone call. And when that news went out, lawyers and human rights workers on a Saturday night left their parties and their cocktail parties and their art openings and things, and they still dressed in their evening clothes. They went as quickly as they could to Logan Airport, to JFK, to airports, and tried to stop this horrible thing from going on. And when I heard the news about it, I started to cry, and I went, oh my God, those people are heroes. Somebody should do something to support them. And a winged idea landed in my brain, and it said, take the words that are written on the plaque at the base of the Statue of Liberty and make it into a song. It's already a poem. And do it in a way that makes us understand all over the United States what our best self is. So I took those words, and I made it into the song, and a couple friends came over, and they helped me get it lined out right. I sent it to my son, who's a musician. I sent him a file. He said, "Sounds good, Dad, good idea, your voice sounds good, but it needs a reliable, singable hook." I went, "Got it, okay, I'll go back and do that." So then I created this song that, according to my son Willie, does have a reliable, singable hook. So you're going to be the laboratory to let us see whether that's actually true. The reliable, singable hook is a chorus. So when you hear the voice, no, that's my voice. When you hear my voice on the video singing, "Give me your tired," you repeat. It'll be, "Give me your tired.
Give me your tired.
Give me your poor.
Give me your poor.
I lift my lamp beside the golden door." And it would be good to feel like the Statue of Liberty and lift your lamp at the same time. So I put it together. Some friends helped me, recorded it in Brattleboro, decided that the best thing to do would be to go to open access photography, get some images for it, put it together, made a video. Don't leave, because it's only 3 minutes long. And let's hit play and then get the bigger screen. Okay? You got it? And remember, when the chorus happens, sing along, okay? See? This is actually a film of Emma Lazarus writing the poem. Well, it's an actor I know.
At our sea-washed, sunlit gate she stands, a mighty woman with a torch, mother of exiles, mother of exiles. Give me your time, give me your time, give me your word, give me your word. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome, while her mild eyes command the harbor where we open to the world. Give me your time, give me your time, give me your, give me your. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. To ancient lands she opens wide her hands, to harbor masses yearning to breathe free. Your homeless refugees, give me your time, give me your time, give me more, give me more. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. The wretched refuse of your war-torn shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp, I lift my lamp, I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Give me your time, give me your time, give me more, give me more. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Give me your time, give me your time, give me more, give me more. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I lift my lamp, I lift my lamp, I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to leave you with a thought that video and the song are out there. I'm still waiting for Bruce Springsteen or somebody to hear the song and decide to sing it. But once the song is out there, it belongs to the rest of the world, and I'm sure that a ripple here or a ripple there is being made. But I'll probably never hear about it, and that's okay. Thank you for your kind attention. If anybody has anything to ask or to say or feedback or questions, if not, you're also free to leave. Yeah?
Where did you grow up?
Pennsylvania. But when people ask me, I also say I really grew up on the farm because I was
wondering where you came from.
I was quite unformed when I got there. Yeah.
I'm a large animal veterinarian and had the privilege to go for calls for sheep on the farm, which of course is still there. This was some years ago that there were some sheep there still. And I walked my dog off into the woods just below the farm where there was a boat. And I'm a boat builder.
Yeah.
And
Hey, I'm a boat builder too.
and I saw this boat sort of in the middle of the woods on a dirt bank with trees growing through it.
Yeah.
And then I looked, so I walked over to the boat and realized the dirt bank was a beaver pond, and the boat had sort of gotten stuck in the breach in the dike of the beaver pond, and that it was a boat I recognized because I had seen the boat in the production of The Tempest.
Oh, so yeah, great.
When I was being 10 years younger or so, when I was about 10 or so.
Wow, lucky you.
And so I was wondering, what about that production of The Tempest? I know that the people at the farm were very active in theater. And could you say about theater, and they put on a couple Shakespeare plays?
Yes,
And
well-
a Magnificent Tempest on the Sweet Pond
Yeah.
near the farm.
There is a film about that,
Yes, I have not seen the film. I understand it's
It's
there.
called Stuff of Dreams. It's been shown a lot. It was shown all around the United States on PBS. When John Carroll moved to the farm in 1974 and said, we're going to do Shakespeare here, I was not enthusiastic at all. I was hard worker, didn't want us to be bothered. We had hay to make, vegetables to do. I just started the farmers market, and we were at one of the first 5 farms at the farmers market. We were organizing it, and I've considered it a tremendous interruption in my life, and I was not very nice to John Carroll, which I should have been, because you never know. I didn't know that I was going to grow up after that to become a Shakespearean, and I, who had begun to do a lot of silent mime, I didn't know that I was going to really enjoy walking out on that island in a loincloth that I had built, with my dreadlocks out to there, with a necklace of bones from the most recent pig that we'd killed, daubed by mud all over, that I had gathered on the walk over, and I got hard. And then while everybody else was stage frightened, I was not stage frightened, because I realized that this was my coming out moment. I who had never really spoken in public before, and I turned around and I went, I must eat my dinner! This island is mine! By Sycorax, my mother! Which thou dost take from me, when thou camest first. And I went on and on and on, and I was like so grounded in my voice and grounded in that. It was so John Carroll's decision to come to Vermont and to move in with us and to do those productions of Shakespeare was one of the absolute spurs that got me off the farm and got me into my life of theater, for which I owe him a tremendous, thank you. We're going to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the farm this June, and we're going to be doing some Shakespeare scenes at the Orchard. You guys ought to come. Should all come. It's going to be great, because we're going. I'm going to be recreating that Tempest scene, and there were 5 or 6 major forces that brought people who lived on the farm off the farm. There was the feeling that they needed to do something more with their lives. There was the theater that got some people off the farm and deciding that they were going to do theater, and that was one of them. I'm so glad. If you ever see that film, you should see the film, because you're probably in it, because the camera pads the audience. Yeah?
So, 2 questions.
Yes.
First one, what's your favorite thing about writing?
Oh, rewriting. That's really unpopular. I mean, I just love to take a piece that I've written really quickly and then just work it, and then work it, and then rework it, and rework it again and again until it just sings. I mean, you could tell from my reading of the recycling piece that I really enjoy reading it out loud, and that's because I enjoyed rewriting it until it got to the point where I go, okay, that went quick. So I love to rewrite.
All right, and my second question is, did you ever lose confidence and feel that you wanted to give up when it came to writing? And what steps did you take to get rid of the negativity? Because I'm going through a similar thing with languages. And right now I feel I'm losing confidence in myself. I feel like it's too difficult. And I feel like giving up.
Well, you should never give up. But it's easy to say. I mean, I guess one thing to say to yourself is that you don't really have to beat yourself over the head if you have a day or 2 days or even a week or a couple of weeks where you can't get it up to write, where you're too busy or you don't have the inspiration. I think writers, particularly young writers like yourself, you should be easy on yourself and not too hard on yourself, and let yourself have those times in which you're feeling some self-doubt. If you're feeling some self-doubt, I would meditate about it and go into it, and you might find that there's a particular some nearby reason that's making you feel that self-doubt. And when you understand the reason for it, you might find that it's not some huge reason, but that it's a very small reason. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of those fears that you would do better to confront. I think, but treat yourself well and be kind to yourself. Okay, is that all right?
Yeah.
Anybody else? Question? Yeah.
All these young folks who are moving back to the farm, and what about the draft?
What about the draft? Well, we had a couple people who had already been in the Army. We had a couple people who were able to get conscientious objector status, which is why our farm formed a nonprofit corporation. Because as soon as we formed a nonprofit corporation based on the farm, we were able to hire a CO or two and give them a safe place to be to wait out the war. In my own case, I went to my draft board, and I failed the physical partly because of my stutter. So I wasn't proud of it. It's probably my most shameful moment of my life, that other friends of mine were risking their lives either at war or risking their futures by moving to Canada or risking so much by burning their draft card. And I went to the draft board, and the Army didn't want me. Still something I don't feel good about. Yeah?
How can I talk to trees?
How can you talk to trees?
Yes.
Well, it's like anything else, you have to put yourself out there. And don't make the first move. You wait for them to talk to you. I mean, first, I wouldn't just go into a forest and start to talk to the trees, just hang out with them, and they'll start to talk to you. That's my advice. That's my experience. I can only speak from my own experience. Anybody else?
Yes.
Yeah? Oh, I'm sorry. Was it? Yes, go ahead. You and me.
I came a little late, but you said you like theater a lot.
Yeah.
How long have you been interested in theater for?
I've been more or less making a living as a theater worker for about 40 years.
Wow. I love theater too.
And somebody who was involved in my theater education when I was just starting out told me, you don't have to go to New York City. You can stay in Vermont. You can make a life here if you're really, really good. And he also said, don't try to be the best. Try to be the only. And that was really good advice, because my performing partner, Stephen Stearns, and I carved out a reputation for pretty much being the only people who were doing our particular kind of work.
Yeah.
So we weren't the best, but we were the only.
Yeah.
You're pretty damn good, though.
Yeah, you had a question too.
Yeah, you talked it when you started reading the excerpt from first on over about your decision to write in the second person.
Uh-huh.
And I was curious about that. I think I've read a few books that attempted that, and I don't think succeeded all that well.
Yeah.
But when I heard you read, I thought it was pretty darn successful, and I'd like to hear you talk more about that. When I heard it, and I think maybe other folks here heard the same thing, it sounded to me like it was you were, the voice was your conscience speaking to yourself.
Yeah.
Showing you where you were going, where you've been, what was supposed to happen.
Yeah. One of the things about that story is that while writing that story, I was on deadline, and I was late to have the manuscript into the publisher, and I was having a really hard time with that story. And I talked to our daughter, and she said, "Dad, maybe you just shouldn't put that story in. Save it for another book." But I really wanted to, because it really completed the thought process about how I had to get off the farm. And suddenly I just decided to, on the first page, to change all the I's to U's, and it just flowed beautifully. And I think it was just for the reason that you say. I wasn't saying to the reader, "This is you." I was sort of taking a step back from myself and from a conscientious place and speaking to myself. And I probably wouldn't work if it were a novel, but it's just a 15-page story. I mean, there is a famous novelist from Mexico, Carlos Fuentes, who I think maybe won the Nobel Prize, and one of his stories, one of his novels, it's only about 60 pages long, but that's the only other novel that I've read that's all in the second person, and it works. I think sometimes when you have a trick, it's kind of unfair to the reader to keep it up for 150, 200, 250 pages. But the fact that this is just a short story means that just about the time that the reader begins to question or to realize what's going on, it's over. Anybody else? Thank you very much, and go in peace. Thank you. And I do.